bulletin at the top of the hour.
Hi, this is Michelle Hussein from BBC World News. Welcome to World Have Your Say, live from the world's newsroom at the BBC.
Well, the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan is certainly causing many of you some concern. The severity of a radioactive water leak there has been upgraded, and it remains unclear to what degree it could escalate further. In the next 30 minutes, we've experts who can help answer the questions you have about what's happening, and we'll speak to people in Japan who are being directly affected. Well, as a first move, let's turn to the BBC's correspondent in Tokyo, Rupert Wingfield-Hayes. And Rupert, just yesterday I introduced a report from you when you went up to look at the Fukushima nuclear plant. What did you see?
Well, you can't get all that close to the plant itself. I mean, we went out on a fishing boat. We got to within about 5 kilometres of the plant, and we went by land to about 4 kilometres from the plant, which is as close as you can get unless you're allowed in on special trips to visit the plant. But what we did manage to do was talk to some workers. It's very difficult to get to talk to any workers at the plant. The whole nuclear industry is very secretive and they do not welcome scrutiny by the media. And workers told me that they would be fired. They would be fired by the company if it knew that they were talking to a foreign journalist. But what they described in the plant was a pretty bad situation. They said morale is low, pay is low, hours are long, there is depression, there is stress, there is no trust in the company, Tokyo Electric Power, which is running the plant there. And one of the workers told me that most of the people drafted into work there are not qualified to work in a dangerous nuclear environment.
And in the last hour or so, we've been inviting our audience around the world to send in questions about what's happening. And one that's coming up a lot, and perhaps you can help us with this, Paul in London tweets us saying, hold on, TEPCO is still running the show at the Fukushima nuclear site. There's surprise that this company remains in charge of it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very good point, and it's a point that is being brought up more and more here in Japan by people as well. Many of the people who live around the plant, some of the fishermen, for example, that I interviewed over the last few days said, look, this is really time for the Japanese government to step in and take over this plant. After the disaster, they handed the plant back to the company that was really responsible for the disaster in the first place to clean it up. 2.5 years later, here we are. There are more and more problems with that clean-up effort. It is a very, very complicated process. But essentially what people are saying to me is, this is too complicated and requires a much more resources, much more money and expertise than Tokyo Electric Power can bring to bear, and it is time for the Japanese government to step in.
And just one more question before I let you go from Chiyizi in Turkey, who's tweeted us saying, is it unhealthy to be living in Tokyo or other Japanese cities? Is the whole country affected?
No. So there were hotspots in Tokyo immediately after the disaster in 2011, but the levels in this part of the country have fallen to safe levels fairly quickly. The main danger is, I suppose, is from living very close to the plant, where I was a couple of days ago. I mean, the dosage levels, we had a Geiger counter, and the dosage levels were okay to spend a couple of hours there, but you certainly wouldn't want to live there. And, of course, consuming anything contaminated, water, fish, things like that from around the plant would be extremely dangerous for you.
Good to speak to you, Rupert. Thank you very much indeed for your time. That's Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, live from the BBC's Bureau in Japan. Sitting here across the desk in the World Have Your Say studio in London is Malcolm Grimston, nuclear expert from Imperial College London, and someone who came on to World Have Your Say just after this happened in 2011. Now, Malcolm, good to see you again. These water leaks have happened before, but not on this scale. Are you worried?
Yeah, I mean, the best information we have about this particular leak is that they did seem to detect it reasonably early. There doesn't seem to be any evidence that it's got into the drains. This was a tank holding water that had been through the first stage of the clean-up process, the decontamination process. So it's not the most heavily radioactive water on the site. And it seems to have leaked out. There was some on the ground, which I gather they've now got back into another tank, but it did seep into the ground, and they're now having to remove the soil and store that. But if it didn't get into the drainage system, then it shouldn't get away from the immediate area and off into the sea. My own guess is that this particular incident probably will not have any very serious consequences. But I think it points up the fact that the accident was so severe, not just the nuclear part, but everything else that went on. I think it's going to be a long time before there is confidence that we know of all the damage that was done. And so it wouldn't surprise me if we continue to see incidents of this nature for quite some time to come as yet.
And with the help of the @BBC World Twitter feed, lots of people around the world are sending questions in for you. I'm not expecting you to be able to answer every one of them, but we'll certainly put as many as we can to you. Justina in Malaysia has just tweeted, can you explain what the effects of the contaminated water are and how long does it actually take to get rid of it?
Well, the contaminated water is caused by the water going into the reactors to cool them down, and when that comes out again, it contains quite a lot of the of radioactive material from the molten fuel inside the reactors. Now, the Japanese have for well over a year now been what we call decontaminating this water. They pass it through a set of filters that stage by stage removes the radioactive material. What they do need, though, is a very large number of tanks on the site, and some of the water which has actually got down to levels that was well within the normal discharges. They're not getting permission to release that because there's so much distrust in the company. So as a result of this, there is quite a lot of radioactive water building up on site. The monitoring that's been done suggests that in the harbour in front of the plant you can detect radioactive material, but you can't detect it outside the harbour. That would seem to suggest, since it's not at detectable levels, that we're not looking at an ocean disaster, and that chances are fishing in the area, for example, would not be producing material that's particularly dangerous. But we do need to continue monitoring that. And I have to say, I understand why people don't trust Tokyo Electric Power. It's not been a very truthful company in the past.
Well, that company has put out a statement. We should read it before we carry on the programme. It reads, we deeply apologise for the great anxiety caused by the latest water leak issue at the Fukushima nuclear power station. We recognise that it's a very serious issue and are implementing countermeasures such as transferring the contaminated water from the leaking tank to other sound tanks, removing the leaked water from the concrete foundation and removing soil near the area of the leakage. So that's the statement that TEPCO has put out. Remember, Malcolm's going to be with us for the whole of this half hour on the BBC World Service. So if you've got questions about anything that's happening at Fukushima, he may well be able to answer them. We're using the WHYS hashtag as always. Now let's bring in three guests who are live with us from Tokyo. Morris and Takahiro, I'll speak to you in just a moment. First though, Ian Thomas Ash is a filmmaker. And Ian, I understand you've been speaking to people who live very close to this nuclear plant. What have they been telling you?
Yeah, so I've just gotten off the phone with one of the mothers that I've been filming for over a year now, and she's talking about kind of what it is that they have to do to protect their children. And with this new leak, she's very nervous about it. She's very nervous about what's contained in the water and what's in their food. And yet she's also worried that her being nervous, just that itself, is going to affect her children. And so she's trying to put on a happy face and try to carry on normally while still having all these fears inside of her mind about what's happening. And so it's very stressful for the parents, I think.
And where are these families getting information about what they should be worried about and what they shouldn't be worried about? Is there a source of information and advice that they trust?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, there of course is the national broadcaster NHK, but I think that there have been enough things that have been happening where information was not released early enough, and that the parents, I think, are beginning to not trust that information. And so in the time that I've been filming in Fukushima, I saw a great rise in the number of mothers who, until the accident, they never used Facebook, they never used Twitter, and suddenly they were using this technology, and they were forming these kind of groups where they were sharing information among themselves. And so I was witnessing kind of this grassroots movement among mothers to share this kind of information.
And I'm sure there are some people listening to you around the world at the moment on the BBC thinking, why don't these families just move? It sounds like a far from ideal place to live.
Absolutely. I think that's a fair question to ask. I think one of the things that we have to remember is that people that have money and that wanted to move, they've done so. And that in my personal experience of filming, one of the things that I have seen is that the people, for example, farmers, maybe all of their land is contaminated, their equipment is contaminated. Even if they wanted to sell their land, it's worth nothing now. And so you're talking about trying to move your family when everything you own and all of your money that's tied up in your land is now worth nothing. And so I think it's very difficult when they're living outside of the mandatory evacuation zones. Yes, they want to evacuate, but it's very difficult to do that without government support.
Good to talk to you, Ian. When does the film that you're making come out? How can we see it?
Well, this is the second feature documentary that I've made. It's called A2BC. It's in film festivals right now all over the world. And it is specifically about children living in Fukushima and the increase in thyroid cysts and nodules that they're finding.
OK, we'll watch out for that. Thank you very much for your time. That's Ian Thomas Ash, a filmmaker who's been working with people near Fukushima. Let's bring in Morris now. He's an English teacher in Tokorozawa, which is about 200 kilometres from Fukushima. I know you're originally from Italy, but your wife is Japanese and you call Japan home now. Morris, tell me about how your life has changed because of your concerns about Fukushima.
Hi. Well, it hasn't changed a lot. It's just the way we feel. Like when we go to buy things, I always usually ask where the fruit or the vegetables come from and the water we use. So now, for example, we buy water and we go to the shop with tanks to collect the water. Usually now there are shops around that offer filtered water.
So you're buying filtered water from shops. And what about produce? Because several people have contacted the BBC saying you can still buy fruit and vegetables that are produced near the Fukushima nuclear plant. Would you buy them?
No, I wouldn't buy. There's something that we should remember that radiation is basically everywhere. Radioactivity is in the air that we breathe.
Morris, I'm just going to interrupt you. I'm going to see if our sound engineers can improve your line to us because we want to hear what you're saying. At the moment, you're coming in and out a little bit. But Malcolm, I'm interested in this issue of what people are eating and what they're drinking. I mean, who are we to judge the concerns that these people have? But does the science add up? Could you do yourself harm by eating vegetables that were grown near this nuclear plant?
I think it's extremely unlikely from what we understand of the levels of contamination in the area, certainly compared to the normal everyday risks that we run from living in a major city like London or Tokyo, for example. Personally, I would not be concerned about eating food from most of the area there. There's a little strip of where the contamination was running to the northwest of the plant, where I think the wind blew the plume. And I think some areas along there, you would take some kinds of precautions. But bearing in mind, for example, that radioactive iodine has a very, very short half-life, they call it. It disappears from the environment very quickly. So that's no longer an issue in the area. That's what might be connected with any thyroid problems. I must say, Ian was saying that there does seem to be some evidence of thyroid disorders in the area. I've not seen any of that evidence as yet. We need to follow that up. But beyond that, I think it's very unlikely that there will be any radiation-related illnesses. The point that Ian was making, though, about the social effects of this are absolutely right. One of the problems with Tokyo Electric Power's trust being so low in the area and them having been blatantly dishonest on many occasions in the past is that, understandably, people will not believe what they're saying, even when they're telling the truth. After Chernobyl, we saw that there certainly were some thyroid, a large number of thyroid cases, although they're usually treatable. But actually, the real consequence of both Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island was psychological. That was the real damage that was done to people's quality of life.
Just remind people of 3 Mile Island. Not everyone will know what you're
3 Mile
referring to.
Island was an accident in 1979 in the United States where there was hardly any release of radioactivity. But nonetheless, people did evacuate voluntarily. There was a lot of stress disorders in the area. Some research that's been done on the Fukushima population suggests that up to about 15% of people are showing signs of post-traumatic stress disorder, which is an enormous psychological response.
Now, you were mentioning TEPCO. We read a statement from TEPCO a little bit earlier. We also contacted the Nuclear Regulation Authority in Japan. They said they would send us a statement. That hasn't arrived yet. We also contacted the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry in Japan. They're responsible for the overseeing of the management of the Fukushima nuclear plant. At the moment, we've received no reply from them. Malcolm, I've got an awful lot of questions for you, but before we put some more to you, let's go back to Morris, whose line we've managed to clean up. And Morris, I was talking to a colleague of mine who talked to you a little bit earlier, and she was saying that your wife's pregnant. So first of all, congratulations. But second of all, is that increasing your concern about the environment into which your child's going to be born?
Well, it is a little bit. It is a little bit because we use a product, Japanese product. So, as I was saying, I heard Malcolm saying psychological issues like post-traumatic stress. Well, we have to remember that radiation is everywhere. It's in the air that we breathe. It comes out from the ground. Everything is radioactive. Bananas, nuts have potassium 40. So, every time we eat, we increase the level that. The level of background that we basically have, no matter if you are in the UK or in Japan or in Italy. So for my wife, for me, that's the main goal is to keep that level, that background radiation that is now a little bit higher than in other countries, to keep that background radiation level a little bit lower. So that's why we are basically buying water and growing vegetables in the garden. That's what we do, and everybody actually does here. You see people going with tanks to the shop to collect water because they have different filters.
Thank you very much for speaking to us, Morris, and best of luck with the new arrival. I hope everything goes to plan. Listening to you has been Takahiro, and Ian Thomas Ash, the filmmaker we spoke to a little bit earlier, has carried on listening to us. He wants to come back in. Ian, give me a couple of minutes and I'll speak to you as well. But Takahiro, you're a translator in Japan. You're a former aide to a member of parliament as well. Tell us your feelings on hearing that the severity of this leak at Fukushima has been increased.
Well, it's really really a disappointment and astonishing event for all Japanese, not just people in Fukushima, but everybody in Japan, because this has been hidden for 2 years and it was already suspected, and the situation is only getting worse by the hour. And that's why, we're just really astonished about it. And this statement you just read out, it really sounds like exactly the same statement they read out when the first accident occurred, which means they only changed a few words of it and maybe the name of the event that they're apologizing about. And, there's not show of sincerity at all.
Well, I've got a tweet here from a listener called Kifi who's saying, it appears to me it's about time the Japanese got help from outside of Japan because they seem to be struggling to deal with this on their own. Would you agree with that? Would you appreciate outside assistance?
Yes, I completely agree. We need international experts' assistance. We need experts coming in. And maybe from what's happening in the ocean right now, the level of contamination in the ocean, I think it could touch on the issue. It could touch on the provision of the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Article 145 states that the member states are responsible not to cause contamination. Mm-hmm. So in the case this contamination is a serious threat to the ecosystem or to any maybe fishery industries around the area, then nations must come in to help Japan because they're not doing it. The government are not doing enough. The TEPCO, of course, is not doing enough either, and even the regulator doesn't know what to do.
Well, Takahiro, let me pick up on this. Let me just jump in because this issue of the seas is coming up a lot in some of the tweets we're receiving. Deborah in New York says, will the radioactive water from the plant affect marine life in the Pacific? Mm-hmm. Malcolm, can you help us here?
Well, the evidence as yet suggests probably not, because outside the harbour, as I mentioned earlier, you can detect a number of different radioactive materials inside the harbour, which is directly in front of the plant. The monitoring that's been done so far doesn't suggest, or there's certainly no clear evidence that this is escaping into the sea, and that's not just Japanese monitoring. There is international monitoring going on. If that's the case, and you can't actually detect the levels, then chances chances are the effect on marine life is going to be minor. I mean, nobody would say that it's a good thing to release this amount of radioactivity into the sea, but I think it's a matter of keeping the whole issue into perspective, that unless we have start seeing some of this material at detectable levels in the sea outside the harbour of the plant, my own feeling is that probably the marine environment is not going to be too desperately affected by this. And even simply being able to detect it doesn't necessarily show that there's considerable amount of harm being done by it. We can detect radioactivity at very, very low levels.
Takahiro, thank you very much for speaking to us. Thanks to Morris as well. Ian Thomas Ash, the filmmaker I was speaking to a little while ago, has been listening to our conversation. And Ian, I know you wanted to come back to Malcolm on something.
Yes, I just wanted to talk about. He was saying that there wasn't really evidence, or he wasn't aware of evidence that there was an increasing number of thyroid cysts and nodules in children. There is that evidence, and what the mothers that I'm talking to are saying is that kind of like just what Malcolm said about the contamination of the ocean. It's not good enough for them to say, well, we're going to wait for clear evidence, or we're going to wait for clear proof that something is wrong. They feel like they need to protect their children, and that once there is that clear link, once there is that clear proof, it's going to be too late. And so these mothers are really asking for the government to monitor the situation and to really help them to prevent their children from getting sick, and to not wait until there is clear scientific proof that there's a direct relation between the children getting nosebleeds, having thyroid cysts, having rashes all over their body, that it's not enough for them to wait for there to be clear evidence. They want help now to help protect their children.
But there were exactly the same suggestions after Chernobyl, and a great deal of research subsequently showed, understandably, that people get to an extent where any illness is ascribed to the accident. In terms of thyroids, the iodine, which is the radioactive isotope associated with thyroid, will all be gone from the environment by now. And if what we were told about iodine tablets being given out is right, then I haven't seen any peer-reviewed, properly carried out research as opposed to anecdotal suggestions. That's not to say it's not there and we won't find that out, but it simply doesn't tally with what we understand from the levels that were happening on site at the time.
Ian, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. Malcolm, thanks for responding to them. Let's bring in Reiji Yoshida, who's a staff writer on the Japan Times. And Reiji, we've invited you because a lot of our listeners are confused about who exactly is in charge of this nuclear plant. Is it the government? Is it TEPCO? How does it work? Can you explain that to our listeners?
TEPCO is responsible for the situation because they have the knowledge and they have skills. The government regulation authority was quite weak, so they couldn't control the situation at all. But the government was reluctant to step in because they didn't want to take responsibility. But earlier this month, the cabinet led by the Prime Minister Abe decided to spend a lot of money on a long-term solution because it has been clear the TEPCO can no longer handle the situation. So they are thinking about the project to freeze whole soil around the whole plant. It costs a lot of money. And the government is pushing for the reactivation of the nuclear power plants that has been suspended after the crisis in 2011. So they want to reactivate the 15 nuclear reactor active countries. So the government needs to regain the trust of the people. That's why they decided to step in and decided to spend some money from the government cover.
Reiji, thank you very much indeed for explaining that to us. That's Reiji Yoshida live from the Japan Times. Now, Malcolm, let's see if we can work through some of these questions in the 3 or 4 minutes that we've got. So I'll ask you for some relatively brief answers if you would. Ramesh in Singapore wants to say, is it really fair to blame TEPCO? The cause was actually the tsunami, and aren't they doing their best? His point being no company could have been prepared for an event of that scale. Well,
subsequent studies suggest that this tsunami ought to have been within the realms, within the limits of issues that were predicted against. I think, to be fair to TEPCO, they have set up the set of tanks, they have set up the decontamination, and that's been very effective, and I think they should be congratulated for that. But the fundamental problem is that they've been very, very slow in coming forward with information for people. And I think in doing that, they've destroyed the trust. And that's what I think is really at the heart of the issue.
Yanhua in Singapore asked a question you've already touched on, really. Are neighbouring countries affected? From what you've been saying, not really.
It doesn't seem to be. You were able to detect, around the time of the accident, some radioactive material in places like Hong Kong and China and so on. But at levels, and even in Tokyo, the levels that were detected were well below what would cause anybody concern.
Now, we've talked about Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island. Martin in Edinburgh would like you just to compare Chernobyl and Fukushima in terms of scale. I think people are sometimes struggling with understanding where these two fit in next door to each other.
Very, very different. And one of the problems with the scale we've been talking about and going up to scale 3 on this incident is it doesn't really tell us anything terribly much at all. Chernobyl was very, very much more serious. I think probably between 5 and 10 times more radioactive material escaped. It was an actual explosion rather than a leak out of the material. That cloud went all the way across Europe, very considerable contamination in Belarus and part of Russia and Ukraine itself, of course. What seems to have happened at Fukushima is most of the radioactive material is still where it should be, and the releases that were such didn't give anybody a very, very high dose, which is likely to lead to long-term health consequences. On the other hand, much more complicated because the site itself was damaged in all sorts of ways apart from the nuclear plant. There were 3 plants involved at the same time, not 1, which makes it more complicated, and the releases to sea have been higher. So not easy to compare the two, but Chernobyl very definitely worse.
Malcolm, thank you very much indeed. We've only got 30 seconds. I'm curious, when you want quality information on Fukushima, where do you turn?
We have to take something from the Japanese, but also the world. The Americans are very much in this, monitoring things. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the plant organisation called the World Association of Nuclear Operators. There are independent voices out there.
Malcolm, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure we'll be having you back on World Have Your Say sooner rather than later. That's Malcolm Grimston from Imperial College London. Thanks to all of you who have sent in questions and to those of you in Japan who've helped us understand how this nuclear plant crisis is affecting day-to-day life. World Have Your Say is back on BBC World Service Radio in 6 hours' time. Next here on the BBC is Outlook. Speak to you very soon. Goodbye.